In our previous discussion, we noted that the sages set out to provide a wide range of alternatives to sacrificial worship. All is not lost with the destruction of the temple. One of the sources that I would have quoted, unfortunately forgot to put in the text itself here, again, Rabbi Lazar said, "Greater is he who performs charity, tzedakah, than he who offers all the sacrifices. For it is said, to do charity and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice." Proverbs 21. So this is just one of many examples where the sages provided an array of alternatives to take the place of temple worship, sacrificial worship. But this takes us a step further. Here we're going to find that these consolations, don't worry, one can survive, the nation can survive without a temple, was taken almost to an extreme, to the extent that we don't really need a temple because we have something that's superior to the temple. And that will be the thrust of our discussion right now. I'd like to begin with a source from the Midrash, Lamentations Rabbah, chapter 4. And I find this Midrash fascinating because of the ending, which we'll get to promptly. A psalm of Asaph, Mizmor le'Asaph. Asaph is the author, the imagined author of a text, of a chapter here of Psalms, and he's singing Mizmor, a psalm, Mizmor le'Asaph. And what is his text? What is he singing about? Elohim ba'u goyim nachalatecha. God, the heathen have entered your inheritance. Psalm 79. Whereupon the authors of the Midrash immediately ask, what is Asaph singing about? A song to Asaph, the heathen have entered your inheritance. The text should have said a weeping of Asaph, a lament of Asaph, a dirge of Asaph. In other words, what's so happy here for Asaph? He's singing about the invasion of God's inheritance, meaning the temple, right? And the Midrash answers, it may be likened to a king who erected a chamber for his son. The king built some sort of structure or some building, or what is translated here as a chamber, which he plastered, cemented, decorated. In other words, the king went all out to provide his son with some sort of structure, decorated as only a king could decorate. But his son embarked on an evil path. In other words, this son that was granted this great beneficence by his father embarks on the wrong path. Forthwith, the king went up to the chamber that he had just built for his son, tore the curtains, broke the rods. In other words, the king destroys everything that he himself built. And then something very strange takes place. But the son's pedagogue, this is the Greek word for teacher, the same word that we know in English, of course. But the son's pedagogue took a piece of the rod, in other words, one of these broken rods from this destroyed structure. The pedagogue took a piece of the rod and used it as a flute and began to play music upon it. In other words, this is the ultimate riddle. The pedagogue is playing music with a rod that symbolizes the destruction of this son's house. So what's going on here? They said to him, the king has destroyed his son's chamber, and you are sitting and playing a tune? In other words, your behavior is totally it makes no sense. The king destroyed his house, his son's house, and you're happily playing music alongside. He replied to them, I play a tune because the king overturned his son's chamber, but did not pour out his anger on his son. And now comes the ultimate, message. Similarly, people said to Asaph, the Holy One, blessed be he, has caused the temple and sanctuary to be destroyed, and you are singing. In other words, again, they approach Asaph. How can you sing when the temple has been destroyed? Elohim ba'u goyim nachalatecha. Right? The heathen have entered your patrimony. And so how can you sing? He replied, I sing because God poured his wrath upon wood and stones and not upon Israel. And this is the ultimate line. God has just witnessed or caused the destruction of the temple, and Asaph seems to be rejoicing, or at least singing. Why? Because all that was destroyed is wood and stones. This I find fascinating. Here for the first, I don't know if for the first time, but striking, the temple, the destruction of the temple is described in words from common life. Wood. The temple is what? It's wood. It's stone, right? Eitz va'even, right? And God then took out his wrath upon stones, upon wood, not upon the people of Israel. For it is written, he kindled a fire in Zion, and it devoured its foundations. The foundations of the building were destroyed, but the people of Israel were not destroyed. In other words, what you find is an attempt here at a positive aspect of the destruction of the temple. And this, of course, raises a question. Who would be interested in stressing the positive elements connected to the destruction of the temple? In other words, the temple, of course, is that chamber, the sun's chamber. It was destroyed by the king who built it himself, clearly, again, an allusion to the temple. And yet, there's something positive here. And what I find here is a major departure in rabbinic literature from the hallowed image of the temple to a building made out of wood and stones. There's something else more important. There's something that transcends a building of wood and stones. And of course, we'll see what that is in a minute. But already you get a sense that the rabbis are preparing us for a whole new approach to what is primary, what is ultimately important, and what is of secondary importance, and something that need not be mourned over or overly mourned over with its destruction. In other words, here you have a policy. And it's not that this source does not offer an alternative. It doesn't say what comes instead of that building that was destroyed. All it says is you need not overweep, right, as it were, or do too much mourning. You need not overmourn the destruction of the temple. Put it in its proper perspective. But of course, where does that leave us? And that takes us to what is ultimately the message that the rabbis are going to provide us with. There is another alternative to temple activity, to temple life, to temple worship. And this alternative is totally removed from the temple. It's not somewhat linked. When I say that prayer is an alternative to sacrificial worship, one can always say, well, yes, there was kind of a prayer in the temple and people recited verses. Now we're going to get to the ultimate alternative, which is a totally, as I say, independent process for achieving God's good service towards Israel. Resh Lakish said, what is the significance of the verse, this is the law for the burnt offering, for the meal offering, for the sin offering, for the guilt offering? I brought the scripture in Hebrew as well, and you'll see why in a moment. Zot HaTorah, la ola, la mincha, vela chatat, vela ashan. Right? This is the law, Zot HaTorah, but we'll see that we have to maybe read it slightly different. The ultimate reading, well, let's read the English translation for it. It teaches that whoever occupies himself with the study of Torah is as though he were offering a burnt offering, a meal offering, a sin offering, a guilt offering. Let's go back to the Hebrew. What the rabbis are suggesting here, and I'll explain in a moment, is Zot HaTorah. This is the real Torah, right? Now the Lamed, La Ola La Mincha, is understood by the Midrash as Zot HaTorah. This is the Torah, the real Torah. Lo Ola, Lamed as short for Lo. lo olah, lo mincha, lo chatat, lo asham. None of these alternatives are the ultimate Torah. The Torah is what one learns, what one teaches. It teaches that whoever occupies himself with the study of Torah, it's as though he were offering. Now here we're only going one step of the way. We'll go further in a moment. It's as though one who studies Torah, it's as if he were offering a burnt offering, right? Olah, a meal offering, a sin offering, and a guilt offering. But now we're already jumping to the 4th century and to a radically new approach to what Torah is all about and how it links up or doesn't link up with sacrificial worship. Rabbah said, why then does this verse say, la olah? What is that lamed here? La olah, la mincha, la chatat, la asham, right? Rabbah asks, why then does the verse say for the burnt offering, for the meal offering? It should have said, Zota Torah, this is the Torah, a burnt offering, a meal offering, etc. And now comes the ultimate statement. Rather, said Rabbah, it means that whosoever occupies himself with the study of Torah does not need a burnt offering, a meal offering, a sin offering, or a guilt offering. This, of course, is a radically different approach to what we've seen until now. Here we are told we're not just looking for alternatives that somehow are similar to sacrificial worship, but are nevertheless, they supply us with what has been lost with the destruction of the temple. Now Rabbah says, if you study Torah, you don't need any of those sacrifices. They've become superfluous. This, of course, takes us into a whole new direction. The direction that says that Torah study and everything that's connected to Torah study has basically taken the place of temple worship. This is the ultimate consolation, but it's far more than a consolation, right? Don't worry, yes, the temple was destroyed, but we have an alternative. This is more than just consolation. This is creating a new ideology, a new theology, right? That says that Torah learning has superseded sacrificial worship, so you do not need a burnt offering, a meal offering, etc. This will be a new radical approach embraced by the rabbis. I will claim that it was embraced, I suspect, more by the rabbis of Babylonia than by the rabbis of the land of Israel, and we'll see why in a moment. Because it creates a process of mobility. In other words, Torah learning can take place anywhere. Sacrificial worship can only take place on the Temple Mount, in a temple context, right? Meaning, of course, an Israel-oriented, land of Israel-oriented procedure. Whereas the study of Torah is totally mobile. It's not connected to any particular area, to any particular location. And it is taught by people who are mobile, meaning rabbis, who don't belong to any particular family. So now what we've done is we've undermined the temple on a number of levels. We've claimed, that Torah study can be done anywhere. And now what I'm also claiming is it can be done by anyone. It does not require pedigree. So we've now pulled the rug out from underneath the feet of priests, as well as from underneath the temple itself in many ways. We have provided a totally independent, a totally new approach to worship that does not require sacrificial worship. This takes us, of course, to the question, where is this coming from? And the direction seems to be, it is from the recognition that sages have taken over the role that was once granted to priests. If priests were once considered to be the teachers of the law, that is not the case today. That now that task has been handed over to sages. But of course, it's created a whole new constituency, right? People can now access sages without going to Jerusalem. Sages can be anywhere. They can be found anywhere, right? But it goes even beyond. A sage ultimately will assume even a higher role than a prophet. Rav Avdimi of Haifa said, from the day the temple was destroyed, so here again, our theme for this series of lectures is what happened after the temple was destroyed. This, of course, refers to the first temple. Prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to the sages. In other words, the destruction of the temple resulted in a whole new structure of priorities and of leadership. There's a new process of leadership. It was taken from prophets and given to sages. Now, you note something very interesting. Who's missing in this text? The priests aren't here at all. They've already been pushed aside by whoever authored this particular text. The prophets, right, have given their role over to sages. And it's further said, and Amebar said, a sage takes precedence to a prophet. In other words, even though a prophet has divine inspiration, obviously he could not be prophesying without God's willingness, nevertheless, a sage takes precedence to a prophet. So here we have a whole new structure created by the destruction of the Second Temple. Now we're entering a new era, as it were, of Jewish leadership, of Jewish self-identity. Let's see another source that refers to the role of sages. He is Alexander of Macedon. In other words, the sages, according to this text, become prominent beginning with the Hellenistic period, meaning the early or mid-Second Temple period. He is Alexander of Macedon, who ruled for 12 years. Until that time, until Alexander, the prophets prophesied through the Holy Spirit. From then on, bend your ear and hear or heed the words of the sages. In other words, again, this text from Seder Olam. And Seder Olam is a relatively early rabbinic text. It probably has its roots already in the late Second Temple period, and then, of course, it was quoted by post-temple rabbis as well. But this is important. In other words, at a relatively early stage, the sages begin to appear, right, taking the role that was once given to the prophets. And again, I stress, there's no mention here of priests. And now the Palestinian Talmud, the Yerushalmi, actually compares the status of a prophet and a sage to again strengthen this argument that sages take precedence to other leaders such as prophets and priests. A prophet and a sage, to what may they be compared? To a king who sent 2 of his senators to a province. In other words, he sent them out as legates, as messengers. He sends 2 of these senators out to a province. Concerning one, he wrote, "If he does not show you my seal and signet, do not believe him." About the other, and I can tell you the first one, of course, is the prophet, and now the other is the sage. About the other, he wrote, "Even if he does not show you my seal and my signet, believe him." So with the prophet it is written, if a prophet arises among you and shows you a sign or a wonder, the prophet has to prove his identity. He has to prove his appointment by God in the role of prophet. Whereas here, regarding a sage, according to the instruction they give you, that you listen to the sage without asking for further proof, without asking for a signet or a seal. The sage is totally independent of any supportive evidence. He need not prove that he is in fact a messenger of God. What does this tell me? There seems to be a policy here recognizing the sage as the new leader, the recognized leader. And the sage, of course, excels in Torah learning. He is a Talmid Chachamim, right? He is the disciple of sages, and this is a whole new authority structure. And now we come to a story that shows us how this idea that sages have taken over from previous authority structures, how they've taken over, and it permeates even rabbinic stories. The story is told, here we see, in both Talmuds, in the Babylonian as well as the Palestinian Talmud, but at different versions. I quoted here the Babylonian one because of a particular line. A fellow by the name of Hananiah, or Hanina, who was the nephew of Rabbi Joshua, and so this takes us to the late first century, early second century of the Common Era, right? Hanina went down to the Golah. Golah here refers to Babylonia. And I can already tell you that ultimately the Babylonian Golah will be, in a sense, the not so much the loyal opposition, but nevertheless the competition, if we like, to the Torah-centered learning in the land of Israel. So we have two centers of learning, one in Babylonia and one in the land of Israel. And now the question is, who has precedence? Hanina went down to Golah, and he would do something that only a recognized sage could do. He would intercalate years and determine the months abroad. In other words, he would be responsible for regulating the calendar, leap years, months, adding a day to the month every now and then. And so he, Hanina, takes it upon himself to do these acts while he is abroad. He began to declare unclean, and they declared clean. What happens to Hanina? He's down in Babylonia, and every time he declares something to be unclean, the local rabbis declare it's clean. In other words, they pick a fight with him. They won't accept his leadership. Here's a rabbi coming from the land of Israel, wanting to assume a leadership role, and the local, I don't know, she called them sages, won't accept his rule. When asked why they oppose his declarations, right? When the sages were asked, why do they depose the declarations of Hanina? They answer, because you, Hanina, intercalate the years and determine the months outside the land. In other words, what they're saying is, you can't do this in Chutz La'aretz, outside of the land of Israel. This is something that only in the land of Israel can be performed, and you, Hanina, are now doing something, acting irresponsibly by organizing a calendar outside of the land of Israel. But now comes an interesting addition to the story. You intercalate the years and determine the months outside the land. He, Hanina, replied, and did not Akiva ben Yosef do so abroad? He's alluding here to a reference in the Mishnah to Rabbi Akiva, who came to the city of Nehar Da'ah in Babylonia, and also added or intercalated the calendar abroad. So he answers by saying, well, I'm not the first one to do this outside the land. Akiva did this. They replied, ignore the case of Akiva ben Joseph, for he did not leave his equal in learning in Eretz Israel. In other words, you can't do this abroad. You cannot intercalate the calendar abroad because you do not have the status, the Torah status of Akiva ben Yosef, of Rabbi Akiva. He did not leave his equal in learning in Eretz Israel. Whereupon he, Hanina, said, I too did not leave my equal in Eretz Israel. I'm the most prominent rabbi here as well. I did not leave my equal in Eretz Israel. Hence I can, in Babylonia, intercalate the calendar, organize leap years, etc. They replied, not so. There's a new generation. The lambs that you left behind in the land of Israel have become rams with horns. But let's look at this text because it's interesting. What is the argument here? The argument seems to be, I can intercalate the calendar abroad because I am the most prominent rabbi today, right? Just as Akiva was the most prominent rabbi of his day, I am the most prominent one today, hence I can organize the calendar outside of the land of Israel. This is a radically new approach, one that says that it is not Eretz Israel that is the only location for organizing the calendar. It is rather the wisest among the sages, the most learned among the sages. It is moving authority from land, from a place, to knowledge. And the difference, of course, is that a place is not mobile. A place remains the same place, Eretz Israel, whereas a sage has total mobility. He can be in Babylonia one day, in the land of Israel second day, and authority remains with him because of his learning, because of his knowledge. This text seems to be saying that we base leadership on a whole new set of regulations. It is no longer, you can do it in the land of Israel, but you can't do it outside the land of Israel. It is rather, are you the most prominent rabbi, as Akiva was in his day? If that's the case, you can do it. If not, you can't. So we see a totally new authority structure provided in a story like this, right? And it's interesting because this story appears in a parallel version in the Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud. It has one of the rabbis getting up in a apparently in a synagogue in Babylonia, and misquoting a scripture. For out of Babylonia shall come Torah. Kimi Bavel tetzei Torah udvar Hashem min har pakod. He's totally misquoting the text, whereupon all of the people that hear this quotation immediately scream out, Kimi Tzion tetzei Torah. How can you do this in Babylonia? One can only spread the word of Torah, or in this case the calendar, in the land of Israel. Kimi Tzion tetzei Torah. In other words, the text seems to be, there's a debate here going on between land orientation to be found in the Palestinian Talmud, where land is critical, you do certain things in the land of Israel, as opposed to the Babylonian Talmud that says, you do these things if the most prominent sage is among you. If knowledge, if learning is to be found in your midst, then you can do this. We have two different, radically different approaches to what leadership, Jewish leadership, is all about, and this seems to be a result of, one of the results of the destruction of the Second Temple. It created a whole new class of leadership. Instead of priests, we see sages, right? Instead of prophets, we see sages. And now the process is no longer it's no longer land orientation. It is now one of knowledge. So the result of the destruction here manifests itself in a manner that we could not have imagined in the years 70, 80, 90. It took off, as we see, only some decades later. What is interesting is that the claim that the land of Israel takes precedence to a concentration of sages, in other words, the opposition approach, appears in a Midrash, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. Here we see the exact opposite to Hanina, or to the sage orientation. Even when there are sages and righteous outside the land, and only a shepherd or a herdsman in the land, it is the shepherd or the herdsman who is to declare the new year. Even if you have prophets, we've seen that prophets have already been, superseded. Even if you have prophets outside the land of Israel, authority to proclaim the calendar rests with the commoners in the land of Israel. So here we have a major debate before us between land orientation, which seems to be maybe the older assumption, and one that is embraced by the sages of the land of Israel, and learning orientation, right? Which seems to have come to maybe to Babylonia first. We don't know if that was the approach originally in Babylonia, but this is a whole new approach that says that learning, provides authority. But as we've seen, learning does not only provide authority. Learning, we've seen, is provided or is presented as an alternative to temple worship, right? One can, Zota Torah, Zota Torah, this is the Torah, not Olah and so on, not sacrificial worship. The Torah is learning of Torah. So we have a new approach to understanding Jewish leadership. This seems to be one of the major results of the destruction of the Second Temple, right? It's a whole new authority structure that emerges as a result of the replacement of the temple. As I said it before, what we have here is an interesting process. Statements that were made as consolation. Don't worry, even without a temple, we can still communicate with God, right? Because we have prayer, because we have learning, we have all sorts of other things. What began as consolation, if it's repeated enough times, you get this critical mass of repetition, ultimately becomes a new ideology. I think or a new theology, as it were, where learning is uppermost now, and it takes the highest role, as it were, of Jewish leadership, at least in the eyes of the sages.